Welcome to the Six Bridges Book Festival, everyone, and happy Halloween also. We're here to talk with the fabulous Dawnie Walton this afternoon. A few housekeeping notes before we get started. There is a chat box on your Zoom screen. If you'll use that to put questions in, we'll try our best to get those answered. And I will also be providing a link to where you can purchase Dawnie's wonderful book. And if you hang in to the very end, we're going to put another fun little link that might connect you to the book even more. So first of all, welcome, Dawnie.
Thank you so much, Rhonda.
It's so great to be able to talk with you today. I'm going to give a little introduction of you and pump your tires a little bit, and then we'll ask you to read a passage from your book. Dawnie Walton is a nationally acclaimed fiction writer and journalist whose work explores identity, place, and the influence of pop culture. A 2015 MacDowell Colony Fellow, a 2017 Tin House Scholar, and a 2018 graduate of the Iowa Writers Workshop. She has worked as an executive level editor for magazine and multimedia brands, including Essence, Entertainment Weekly, Getty Images, and Life. A native of Jacksonville, Florida, today she lives in Brooklyn. And we're speaking with her about her novel, The Final Revival of Opal and Nev, that was deemed a spectacular debut by Publishers Weekly, named one of 2021's most anticipated books by Essence, Vogue, the Oprah Magazine, Elle, The Independent, and a whole bunch of others. Welcome, Dawnie, again.
Rhonda, thanks so much for the wonderful intro, and thanks to everyone for spending a bit of your Halloween with us, taking a little break from the trick-or-treaters. A little bit about the book before I start reading it. The bulk of it is written as an oral history, meaning it's a bunch of interviews with people talking about Opal and Nev, who are an interracial rock and roll duo who have a moment of fame in the early 1970s and then kind of fall apart and go their separate ways with different results. And the person telling their story, curating all these interviews, is a journalist named Sonny Shelton. And what I'm going to read to you from the very beginning of the book is Sonny's editor's note, kind of giving context around the story that she's about to tell. Disclosure. My father, a drummer named Jimmy Curtis, fell in love with Opal Jewel in the summer of 1970. For the duration of their affair, he was married to my mother, who, in 71, got pregnant with me. Before my birth, before the world had a chance to know much about my father beyond these facts, he was beaten to death by a racist gang during the riot at Rivington Showcase. And before my mother could bury his broken body, his mistress blazed to stardom. This is a personal history that, throughout my life, I've taken significant pains to conceal. In my 25 years as a journalist, I've never needed to lean on it. I got here under my own steam, toured the world's most dazzling arenas with U2, won awards for following funny money raised by benefit concerts, even interviewed artists who, oblivious of my connections, cited Opal Jewel and Nev Charles, together and solo, as their heroes. Santa Gold, the White Stripes, and the Yeah Yeah Yeahs, to name just a few. All this work I've compiled as S. Sonny Shelton, the name I put to legal papers on my 18th birthday. My chosen name, this hard-earned byline, cobbles together the first initial of my birth name, my favorite word as a child, and the Philadelphia street where the umber facade of my maternal grandmother's row house decays flake by flake. You could say that every decision I've made to divorce myself from the violent birth of Opal and Nev has been like this, intentional, and a touch paranoid. So you ask, what the hell am I doing now? Writing the foreword for a story I swore I'd never tell. I could justify my involvement in this project by explaining that the internet and cable news have changed the game for journalists, stretching the boundaries of what's possible and upending all the rules we thought we knew. I could tell you that in this new era, readers and television audiences now accept, even expect, a flavoring of bias. But I wouldn't want to bullshit you. This book exists because in March 2015, when I was named Oral's editor-in-chief, the first African-American and first woman to win the gig since the magazine launched in 1965, I gave myself permission to write it. Understand that before my big come up, I've been playing a game familiar to many women of color outnumbered in our industries. I worked hard, kept my head down, and made a meticulous, watertight case, supported by data-stuffed PowerPoints, for every idea I ever pitched. And still, I worry that the reasons for my success would be questioned by even my most progressive white colleagues. I imagine that at cocktail parties, the bane of my socially anxious existence, they would gossip about me after I left their huddles, roll their eyes and snark to each other between bites of crab cake. Isn't diversity wonderful? After our young new publisher offered me the promotion, I nonetheless closed the door of my office on the 14th floor, opened the window that looked down onto Liberty Street, and screamed victory to the poor tourists below. I felt pride, of course, but something more, something better, freedom. Freedom to trust my tastes, take my own counsel, make bold moves. Here was a chance, or so I assumed, to pursue every fascination I had ever wanted to follow, but didn't feel that I could. I looked up at the 1972 Vogue photo of Opal Jewel that I'd pinned to a corkboard, its significance to me carefully shrouded among all the other rock memorabilia I kept there, and I thought, maybe it's finally time. As if on cue, like the supernatural force I'd always imagined her to be, Opal Jewel appeared in my life not long after that reverie. At the April 2015 taping of a Netflix music special honoring studio wizards, the first high-profile event I'd attended since taking Oral's reins, I ran into her, literally ran into her, as in both of our clutches fell to the floor, her bullet of lipstick, and my cell phone clattering across the marble. This happened inside the ladies' lounge at New York's Gotham Hall, minutes before the event was scheduled to start. Nev was on the bill, set to play a couple of his old solo hits in tribute to Rivington Records super producer Bob Hayes, and Nev's presence had made me skittish enough. But even considering the honoree, no one had expected Opal would show up. Ironic, considering shock was once her forte. She hadn't made the scene in decades, and that night her attire was subdued. She wore a simple black shirt dress with a yellow paisley turban hugging her scalp instead of one of the old, wild wigs. Still, I knew instantly who she was. I know her the same ways that you do, as Nev Charles's one-time partner in Strange, the ebony skin provocateur, the fashion rebel, the singer, screecher, Afro-punk ancestor, the unapologetically Black feminist resurrected via gifts and Instagram quotes for these intense political times. Of course, through my lens, so many other identities were superimposed. Here was my father's crazy girlfriend, the one he'd got himself killed for, the source of my mother's pain and, by extension, her frustrations with me, my most complicated idol. At first, when we collided, her gliding in through the door, me stalking out in the treacherous high heels I'd worn to walk the red carpet, Opal Jewel shot me the side eye of life, the honey please expression to launch a million new memes. And then she squinted as I scrambled to pick up her handbag. She raised my lowered head with a finger under my chin, and she called me by the first name I ever had, the name that my father, I would later learn, had intended for me, improvised from a dream. Saralina, she said, and it wasn't even a question. Jimmy's girl. And I'll stop there. Thank you.
Oh, that's a wonderful segment. And you introduce the conflict and what's to come right out of the gate. And I'll have to tell you, I've listened and watched some other interviews you've given, and other people like me, that it's so gripping and well done to start out with. I kept thinking this has to be nonfiction. I kept looking. I know it's novel. I know it's fiction. Intellectually, I knew, but it's so well done. What led you to choose oral history as the way to present the story?
So I was really thinking about my days in journalism, and I worked for many years at Entertainment Weekly, and we often used oral history when we, were celebrating the anniversary of like a movie everybody loves, for instance, or an album that people, it's a classic in people's minds. And what was so great about the form was that it instantly lends an iconic status to anything, because you're interviewing several people who have a million things to say about that movie or album or television show, who have a million memories that are close to their heart. They have conflicting memories. And it just rises to a level of feeling big. And I wanted Opal and Nev from the start to feel big and significant, and that they mattered a lot to a lot of different people. And I also just loved the form because it was so playful. It made the writing very much fun for me to do, to switch voices. There's a lot of strong personalities in the book, and just thinking about how they would remember everything so differently or have different perspectives. And so the reader becomes more engaged because they're trying to figure out what's true between the stories they're getting from everybody. So it was great fun to write in that format. And it kind of cut out a lot of the work that you have to do of like transition. You just go from voice to voice to voice and personality to personality. So I loved it.
No, and it's such a fast read because of that way. And as an old trial lawyer, I can tell you that people remembering things different ways used to be the bane of my existence and trying to get a case to trial. But it's very, very true. And it provides a lot of different perspectives that you wouldn't otherwise get in the narrative. So growing up in Florida, which I know you did, now you live in Brooklyn, but what did you do to understand the culture of the 70s in New York and Detroit, which is where these stories kind of start?
Well, luckily, interestingly enough, I'm fascinated by that era of music. I was born in 1976. And so when I was a kid, my parents were still listening to music of that time. I mean, I remember, Marvin Gaye's What's Going On was a big one, a lot of Stevie Wonder. And when I got older and kind of fascinated by alternative rock and punk and indie rock, I started being interested in sort of the roots of that music. And so then, going back and listening to a lot of Bowie and, from later in the decade, some, T-Rex and all of those things. And I was just so interested. If you look at the Billboard charts from that era of music, it is so mixed up. Like there's so many different kinds of things going on. You have Southern rock, becoming very big through Leonard Skinner, who were from my hometown and were the inspiration for the Bond Brothers in the book. And the Allman Brothers Band, you had that, but you also had, of course, the soul that I just mentioned. You had Laurel Canyon scene and sort of the folk music coming out of that. You had proto-punk, punk didn't explode until a little bit later, but you had like the beginnings of all of that. And I thought it was just interesting that all those things had different fan bases, And so when I was thinking about the concert that's sort of at the center of the book, the Rivington Showcase concert, and thinking about a label that was trying to like just throwing spaghetti against the wall to see what sticks, and what it would have been like to have all these different kinds of fans and fan bases in that same room, and imagining what might have happened.
So because Opal is a force. And you did make both Opal and Nev, and a lot of the characters are just very much larger than life almost. I love Virgil. One of my favorite characters is Virgil. But Opal is a great protagonist. And I've heard another interview where you described the three women, that Opal's kind of an amalgamation of these trailblazers in fashion music. So can you describe for the audience who you kind of had in mind when you created Opal?
Yeah, for sure. So as you said, there were three main women, and then there were little pieces of others. So the three, one of them was Grace Jones. When I was thinking about kind of like the physical look and presence and boldness of Opal, I was really drawing on Grace Jones. And in fact, when I was first writing, before I kind of honed the characters, my kind of elevator pitch was, imagine if David Bowie and Grace Jones made music together in early 1970s New York City, which is something that seems like it might have happened, right? But it,
Right.
never really did. I mean, I think he wrote a song for her once, but they never, as far as I know, really performed together. So Grace Jones was the first. Nona Hendrix was one third of the band LaBelle, who we all know for Lady Marmalade and that hit song, but were actually, really rock and roll stars. I mean, they were the first Black rock and roll vocal group on the cover of Rolling Stone. And Nona Hendrix did most of the songwriting for LaBelle. And it was very kind of futuristic feeling. She had a real love for rock music. And then the style of LaBelle as well. They would wear these sort of silver outfits with feathers stuck all over them. And I just loved their sisterhood, and the fact that sometimes the music was political as well was part of it. And the fact that Nona Hendrix went on to make rock and roll solo records and work with a lot of bands and artists that I admire. So she was number 2. And number 3 was a cult funk star in the early 1970s, Betty Davis, who was a former model and a songwriter. And she had an electric stage show where she would wear fishnets and teddies and do very sexual, it was the sexual energy that she had to the music. And it was really in your face. And she more vocalized than sang, and she had all these really interesting, very swaggering songs. But what happened was her label kept trying to tell her what to do. And she was like, forget that. I'm not gonna play this game anymore. And she basically went back to Pittsburgh, where she's from, and has been a recluse there ever since. So those were the 3 women who were sort of the primary inspiration for Opal. But then, of course, you have Nina Simone, her political sensibility. You have Tina Turner, for the music that she makes and the attitude with which she carries it. I was also thinking about younger artists who might have been influenced by an Opal Jewel. So thinking about Janelle Monáe, or thinking about Santa Gold. So it was all those women I was thinking about that kind of had a little stake in her.
She's, and as you describe all of these icons, I can picture in my mind after reading the book. I'm like, oh yeah, Opal did this and this, and Opal dressed like this, and Opal used this, and she wasn't going to let people tell her what to do.
Yeah.
Which is one of the things I love most about Opal. But and Nev gets introduced he gets introduced on page 22 of the book. He's British. You've likened his image, I've heard in another interview, to Benedict Cumberbatch, which I appreciated because I kept having some struggles. I went with Ed Sheeran at one point, and I was like, this is not Ed Sheeran. But I really wanted to like Nev more than I ended up liking Nev. How did you create that character in the way that his and Opal's worlds finally do collide?
Yeah. So I think that, on the surface, Opal and Nev have a lot of differences. Their socioeconomic backgrounds are different. Of course, their different genders and races and nationalities. But what I really wanted to do was to have some similarities between them as well. The major one being that they had both grown up feeling a bit lonely and a bit like outsiders. And then that was the thing that brought them together. And they are both, the other thing that they have in common is that they're both hugely ambitious. How that ambition manifests through the book, however, is what ultimately pulls them apart. how far they're willing to go for that ambition. But at the core, they both really, really, really want it. They both really, really want to be adored and loved. And with Nev, really, I don't know. People have said Ed Sheeran a lot, and I was like, that's interesting. Like I can't really.
I think we're trying to pull from the red hair. I think that's all we had. I don't know.
Yeah. I was thinking physically, not personality wise, but physically, I was thinking about Bowie again in terms of like the beanpole kind of, and in the time when David Bowie had his red hair, I was thinking about that. But really what I was thinking about too is the idea of a chameleon, and an artist who has had a very long career and has been able to sort of artistically change direction depending on the times, and it's been fine. And in fact, it's been successful to be changing like that. And so when I was thinking about his career being chameleon-like, I was also thinking about how that would affect him on the inside, doing all that changing and sort of like going where the wind blows in order to kind of maintain this attention that he really, really seems to need.
When you're writing about the big event,
yes,
I found myself so anxious because of the buildup you had set out at the very, in fact, what you read to us today from Sonny's note and the complex relationship that Sonny has to the rest of the folks in the story. But I found myself so anxious, and I knew it was coming. I knew, because you're writing about the Rivington showcase, it's getting closer. The scene is set with the people who come to the showcase and are causing some problems. And I was so anxious. I like put the book down. Am I ready to read this yet? So, and you told it through the multiple voices again, almost as if it's like they're sitting in the audience and they're telling their viewpoint, or they're behind stage. And so how difficult was that to write? And how long did it take you to write that scene? What happened?
Well, thank you for all those nice things that you said about it. It was I found myself anxious while I was writing the scene, honestly, for many reasons. One reason being that I really struggled with the emotion and the trauma of it. This is probably the book, I think, has a lot of lighter and very funny moments, but this particular part is actually the heart in your throat kind of violent moment in the book. And I struggled for a long time with what was actually going to happen. And it's not a spoiler to say, because it is the first sentence of the book, that the drummer Jimmy Curtis is killed. And it took me a long time to make my mind up that was going to happen. And then I had to write about it. This is, however, when the oral history form was actually very beneficial in writing it, because I literally, when I was writing the scene, I had kind of a diagram. And I was placing the characters in different places. So you had Opal and Virgil and the Curly Cutes, and all of them were backstage. And Bob Hyes was between the balcony and the lobby, and Rosemary Salducci was at the door. And all these characters then began to work as cameras almost that had different viewpoints from, and so it was like, I wanted also time to slow down in that moment, because before that, the book moves at quite a quick clip. Like we go through years from their childhood until, getting to New York and all of those things. And then I wanted time to slow down. So it was like I had a viewpoint on everything, so I could tell it straight through from beginning to end. And that's how I wrote it, was, with the help of visual aids.
So intelligently done. Like I said, it did create a lot of angst.
Yeah.
And of course, again, that you mentioned so many of the characters, and that's why everyone, again, go buy this book. It's so good. And you fall in love with all of these different people. And again, I want a Virgil in my life.
Yeah.
I want a Virgil. He's just awesome. There's also, and I think what I'm going to ask you about now, I think probably comes from your journalistic background, but you make a photograph very much a part of the story.
Yeah.
And it's very vivid, and at one point you even, I think it's an interview or someone discussing an interview with the photographer. How did you choose to introduce that photograph almost as a separate character?
Yeah, well, you're right. That was directly from my career in media. For about 3 years, my favorite job in media ever was working for Life.com, which was the rebirth of the classic Life magazine. And basically, the concept of the website was connecting the past and the present. And so we would, for anniversary dates of different things, Woodstock, the assassination of Bobby Kennedy, or any of those events. Of course, Life covered all of those things and had some iconic imagery from these things. And we would call to a warehouse in New Jersey that had boxes and boxes of, not only the classic photographs, the individual shots, but also all the contact sheets and negatives surrounding it, as well as the photographer's notes. So the photographers used to type up on onion skin the stories of what happened, the stories of their assignments. And there were other times when, at the time, some of the photographers who were actually there were still living, and I would interview them. And what was always fascinating was to understand, how the viewer is seeing an image and what it's evoking in them, and understanding the gap between that and what really happened, what's the real story behind it. I mean, just as an example, of course, I never got to talk to Eisenstadt. He was long dead before I was alive, but the photo of the sailor and the nurse kissing in Times Square.
Yeah.
Right. There's been a lot of conjecture about what was really going on there, but as the viewer, it's just this sort of moment of great romance and American victory, but we don't really know what happened. And so I was always fascinated by that idea. And I knew when I was writing this book that I wanted to have a moment like that. I wanted to have an event that was covered by a photographer, and an image that would actually put Opal and Nev on the map, launch them into fame, and then get at the real story behind it, the real emotion behind it, how Opal really feels about it, why it terrifies Nev. And I thought it was rich material to work with.
It was fantastic. I want to take a break just a second, because I could just have a conversation with you for the rest of the day. And I know that's the point. But one of our audience members, thank you so much, Carolyn, for writing in and asking. She asked you, she says, your writing was so gripping. Who was your imagined audience?
Oh, I've never been asked that really before. I think that I wanted to write the novel. I think I was speaking to Black women, honestly, who were sort of like me in the sense that, liking music that wasn't necessarily like music in which you saw yourself reflected. Or Black women who had navigated different aggressions or microaggressions in their careers. I think one of the things I wanted to do was to mirror the stories of Sonny and Opal, and kind of I would love for Black women to be able to find themselves in this book. Whether it's women my age or women like my mother who had a very like emotional reaction to some of the stuff in the book. So, you always kind of like when you're creating, you're really just trying to please yourself, I think that's what makes you feel the most free as a writer. And so, like, when I'm writing for myself, I'm writing for people who look like me and have had similar experiences to me. But it's always so wonderful when audience that I didn't really expect to come to the book and to enjoy the book when they're getting something out of it as well. So that has been like a great joy and a blessing.
Oh, I think your audience has ended up being so much more expansive than possibly who you wrote for. I mean, you were big discussions on Jimmy Fallon. You were in that competition to be his book club.
Right.
Cheryl Strayed had you as her featured author last month. I learned so much. The one thing I love is when I read a book and it sends me to dictionary and Google and everything. And that did that for me. And also the musical references were so wonderful because I was growing up in the 70s and my older brother and sister definitely listened to a lot of the same music that's referenced in your book. So, but I want to go back to what you said about your mom in answer to, and Carolyn, thank you for your question. She has another one in here that I'm going to save till the end because you and I've kind of already talked about it and I know what the answer is going to be. I want to save it a little bit, but you said your mom had a very emotional reaction to reading your book. Are you at liberty, without breaching any mom-daughter stuff, are you at liberty to discuss that a little bit?
Well, I think, of course, since she's my mom, she was super proud of me and the fact that I kind of like made this lifelong dream because she remembers me writing stories as a kid. The fact that I was able to like see that dream coming true, I think was emotional for her. But I think also, she lived through a lot of that tumultuous time that Opal was living through and sort of trying to find her own voice, I think, as well as a young woman, the same way. I mean, the book is honestly like a big part of what it's about is Opal finding her voice and understanding how to use her voice. And I think, to some degree, my mother could relate to that. And she also loved the chapter in Paris,
Yes.
Someplace that, she's never been. And she was sort of fascinated by that idea of Opal kind of trying to come to terms with a lot of different things and experience some world in that moment.
I enjoyed that as well. And her experiences and with the record shop there, music shop where she, I think, gained some confidence. And anyway, that was great. I do want to go back because you said kind of when we got started today that Leonard Skinner was kind of your reference point for the Bond brothers.
Yes.
And I have so much I want to ask, but I also don't want to give away everything for the readers because they really do need to go read this book. But I had such an immediate dislike for Chet Bond in particular, kind of the lead brother, I guess, in the Bond brother band. So, and yet you use his voice to drop, I think, the biggest bomb moment, the biggest, oh my gosh,
yes,
are you kidding me moment in the book. So how did you come to write that character and why did you choose his voice to drop that massive moment?
Rhonda, I love this question. I've never been asked this question before.
Really?
Yeah. Okay, let me start to, so I was thinking, I was writing a lot of this book in 2015 into some of 2016. And a lot of that time, I was sort of processing the things that were happening in real life politically. And one of the conversations that was happening again, of course, was around the Confederate flag and what it means, how it affects different groups of people, the debate around that. And I was thinking about the activist Bree Newsom having climbed that flagpole and pulled that state flag down that had the Confederate flag. And I was thinking about how it has always been, for people like me, it's felt like a threat whenever I've seen it. And growing up in Jacksonville, where Lynyrd Skynyrd is from, and being a fan of, rock and roll, but mostly like from the UK, because bands like Lynyrd Skynyrd draped themselves in the Confederate flag and Confederate iconography. The t-shirts, like all of this kind of like, it just had a lot of energy that was off-putting to me as a Black person. And this is not to say that Lynyrd Skynyrd weren't brilliant musicians. These songs, ironically, Mary Clayton sings on Sweet Home Alabama on the chorus and talked about her conflicts in doing that. And the reason that I had Chet Bond be the one to drop that is because, again, writing this book in the era of the rise of Trump, I think that there were a lot of uncomfortable truths that were coming to light. Things that were sort of, in my mind, very ugly, but had been always true about the United States. And the fact that things that were sort of long unspoken started bubbling up, and people were saying these things or displaying these things with pride. And so I think that was very eye-opening to a lot of people, and a lot of people would say things like, this is not America, this is not this country, but in a very honest way, yeah, that's part of it too. That's very real. And so that's why I wanted that revelation, as upsetting as it is, to come from Chet Bond's mouth.
I see.
Yeah.
And in the book does kind of conclude with an allusion to what's going to happen in the fall of 2016. Of course, fall 16 started a very significantly challenging period of time in the United States. So was there a reason, because your book was published this past spring, right? February or March, I think.
Mm-hmm.
Is there a reason that 2016 was your stopping point for their particular story?
Well, I think, I finished writing, I think, in 2018. And then, of course, it goes through the editing process and everything. But I think that we were still living through that time, and I didn't think that I would have the proper distance to really go any further than that.
Yeah.
I had lived, of course, the election and a lot of the fallout, but I think we were all still making sense of it. And so, I just wanted to kind of end it there. And I think I knew that I didn't want it to be a neat ending. I wanted it to have some uncertainty, and the bow is not completely tied, and I think that's a lot of what we felt at the time. That was the note that I wanted to end on, because that's what life was like. I thought it just would have been too difficult to make any, conjecture or declarations about anything past that, because I didn't know at that point, what was going to
Well,
happen, what the future was going to be.
and I think those of us who have read the book, we're honestly hoping there might be more forthcoming with some of the characters. I feel like there's so much more to Sonny's story. Have you thought about that at all?
It's so funny that you say that, Rhonda, because I ended up, the draft that I turned in initially as a manuscript was probably 120 pages or so longer.
Oh, really? Oh, okay.
And a significant portion of that was telling more of Sonny's story, and Sonny's coming of age and her relationship with her family, primarily her mother, and the complication of Sonny loving Opal Jewel from afar, and how that sort of was a pain point in her relationship with her mother. And so there was like a whole section where I had Sonny interviewing her mother from her mother's perspective about the time just after Jimmy's murder, and the arrangement, the partnership that she and Opal make for Opal to, this is a little bit of a spoiler, but not much, to pay for Sonny's education, and to, as sort of a way of making amends for her role in the events that ended up killing Jimmy. So yeah, there was that whole section, and I loved it, but it just sort of slowed the momentum of the story. It just kind of made it feel less propulsive. And so my editor, the wonderful Dawn Davis, really convinced me that this is good, but it's not a part of this book. And maybe it'll be part of another book in the future. And I haven't quite figured that out, but I will say that I read those pages very often and think that maybe there's something in them.
That's fantastic. A quick reminder to you folks out there listening, if you have questions of Dawnie, please put them in the chat box. I will try to get to them. And before we go on to some more around the story, doing some research and getting ready for today, I kind of stalked your social media a little bit. And I found where you had posted a picture of a pillow that your husband had bought you as a surprise. And the words on that, can you explain that a little bit? Because I just loved it. It was something that my favorite character says.
So first of all, my husband is a fantastic gift giver, and also very creative. He's a creative director by profession. And so he had this pillow made, and the quote on it is a quote from Virgil. And it's, "Mon Dieu, we make a gorgeous noise." And so this is referring to a moment during the Rivington Showcase concert where there's sort of the bottom rows in the orchestra of this concert are being very boorish, I will say. I'm trying not to give anything away. They want the Bond brothers to come on, and yet there's all these other acts to get through, and they're being very aggressive with the talent, including Opal and Nev. Virgil is up in the balcony, which is full of New Yorkers who don't want to take this. And so there becomes like a shouting match between the upstairs and the downstairs. And the gorgeous noise is the sound from the balcony trying to shut down the nastiness happening in the orchestra. So, but I think, on a broader level, I was interested, like I thought of this phrase, a gorgeous noise. And I was thinking very much about my time in New York, and some of my favorite moments in New York have been the moments where we feel united in some way. I mean, my favorite day in New York, I talk about this a lot, was in 2003. the blackout that happened here in the city. Everyone here was still very much on edge from 9/11, but that day of the blackout, for about 5 minutes, we were all terrified that something else was happening. It was another terror attack. And then when we found out that it was just like a power outage, like the sense of relief and almost joy of people coming down out of office buildings and walking across the bridge and helping each other, and the bodega owners, feeding everyone. And like, I think about that when I think about like the happier noise of New York City, the energy of New York City. I was thinking about that.
That's a beautiful tie-in. Yeah, and in 2 years, that was just 2 years after.
Yeah.
So I can imagine. We have another question in our chat box from Phyllis. She writes, through the research for your book, what was the most fascinating thing you learned?
Oh, the most fascinating thing I learned. So I do a lot of footnoting in the book.
Yes, it's wonderful.
Thanks. And some of them are, I think they certainly serve a purpose, but one of them was just like, you could clearly, it was like a little bit indulgent. You could clearly see my interest in this, but it's a moment when Sonny is finally looking at all the photographs on Opal's wall in Los Angeles. And she notices this image of a woman named Stephanie St. Clair. And that's in there because I had somehow in my research, I stumbled along Stephanie St. Clair's story. She was a Black woman who was basically a queen of numbers running in Harlem. Policy banking is the technical word for it. But she was smart and political. She used her money to help educate Black kids. She put all the money back into the neighborhood. She was actually a mentor of Bumpy Johnson's. And she is actually, in fact, played by Cicely Tyson in a movie called Hoodlum. And I actually had Opal auditioning for that role because she was sort of like a woman who had like the mob bosses in check, the cops in check. And she was just an incredibly strong, by any means necessary kind of woman who made some very tough choices and tried to help her community the best way she could. And so I just loved that story of Stephanie St. Clair.
Yeah.
And I wanted to kind of squeeze it in somehow into the book. So it ended up in that footnote.
The footnotes were another reason I kept thinking, no, this has got to be real. They're so great. And they also have a lot of such great historical references to things that were truly going on at that time. So you do have Opal in this period after the Rivington showcase where she and Nev try to work together, for a while. They even show up on the Dick Cavett show at one point.
Yeah.
And then things go sort of south on the tour and they head their separate ways.
Mm-hmm.
And there's a very different trajectory that they each take. But you have Opal showing up at one point in a movie where she has a scene that sort of develops a cult following and she becomes a GIF. And how did you devise that? And what was the importance of that in pulling together the narrative for Opal's story?
Yeah. So I loved writing about this movie, this fake movie. The fake movie is called Any Which Way, and it's sort of like a teen comedy of the 80s. And the star is Christina Applegate, and she has sort of like these mentors, these witches. So she's a teen witch, and then she has like this trio of witch mentors. One is Swoosie Kurtz, the other is Penelope Ann Miller, and the third is Opal Jewel. I wrote it because I was very interested in celebrity images and how they kind of calcify, right? And so I was thinking of, this is happening in a moment where Opal is a little down on her luck, her music career has petered out. Nev is allowed to be chameleonic, but Opal, not so much. Like in the public imagination, she has pretty much one role, one way to be. And so I was thinking, well, how would that translate to screen? Like if she were going to be in a B movie, what kind of part would they think of her for? And for this movie, of the three witch mentors, she's sort of like the stereotypically sassy, like, scary, they sort of dress her in these rags and like all of this stuff that is just like very cringy. And Sonny sees this, as a teenager, and she's just like, oh my God, this is so embarrassing. But, for Opal, it was a way for her to kind of keep money going, keep things going. And so like, that's why I wrote that. And I think I sort of had it in there to show like how she's still kind of known, but not in a way that like she would want to be known. And it's sort of the low point, for where things were for her in that moment.
Towards the end of the book, we do get the so-called revival, sort of. Again, I'm showing the book because this is what it looks like. People need to run out and go get it. But at the point that they come together, Opal and Nev are I hate to say old, especially as I start approaching those ages, but there's a 45, let me say that, there's a 45-year difference kind of between the big showcase where the event happens and the revival. What was the thinking behind that time frame in bringing them back together at that point?
Yeah. So when I was thinking about 2016, as I said, I was thinking about sort of the rise of Trump, but I was also, of course, thinking about the rise of the opposing force. And I had always imagined that in the 1970s and on that timeline, that Opal was always slightly ahead of her time. Like she was never quite, like she was sort of shocking and interesting. People didn't know what to make of her. And so like the pieces never kind of came together for her to be as huge as she should. And so I was thinking about 2016 as a time when Black women are given a bigger microphone and people are starting to listen to us a bit more. And the things that Opal is saying are resonating and they make a lot more sense. So, I say in the beginning, Sonny says in the beginning of the book, this is a moment where it's like she's not ahead of her time, but she's very now. And so when I was thinking about, the big revival concert is at a festival that I sort of was thinking about, it's a Coachella type festival. Yeah. It's called Daring Do, and they do a reunion show every year. And this year they want to do Opal and Nev because, Opal is part of the conversation a bit more. Some old clips of her beginning to circulate among people. There's a TED talk around this photo of her and Nev that made them famous. And so it was almost like they're beginning to switch positions because Nev, who has sort of played it very safe and almost has sort of like a Rod Stewart kind of trajectory, he's sort of like declining a bit. He's still very hugely famous and very rich, but he's not really relevant anymore, but Opal is. And so he really sort of needs her to do this show, and then she needs his notoriety, his fame. They need each other in a really, really interesting way. And so to see them come together after 45 years, it was a fun scene to write.
Again, just how did you come up with the name of the festival? I had to Google it because I was like, is she writing about a real festival in New Hampshire? But you come up with the name of the festivals. You came up with the name of their first record and all of their songs. And, how hard is it to do that as a writer?
I'm trying to remember how I came. So the festival is called Daring Do. And I just thought it was a fun word to say and kind of was a spirited word. And like I was thinking about like names like Lollapalooza, which is like another fun word to say. And kind of, I think Daring Do, I could imagine a festival with a spirit of daring do, and it doesn't matter the genre, but just like all artists who have this sort of daring and this energy. So that was the name for that one. And then Polychrome, which is the first Opal and Nev album. I knew that I wanted it to be sort of like a concept album, and Nev is the writer at that point, and he's writing like each song is based around a different color. And so that was that one. And I was thinking about, Opal kind of has her butterfly moment, where she goes into the studio and she makes, with Virgil's help, she makes herself over, and she wears this sort of rainbowy kind of outfit with these almost like a circle dress with like these wings and things like that. So I was thinking about the sound of words, and I was thinking about imagery and all of those things that come into play when you're naming something.
No, it was fantastic. I know we're getting close to our hour, and I'm so sad because I have so many other questions. I will remind people that we have listed somewhere in the chat where you can buy the book through Wordsworth Books. Also, if Caleb could go ahead and put up our link, you created a Spotify list that I was playing, getting ready today. Tell us a little bit about how you did that.
Yeah, so
it took me
so long to put this Spotify list together because I was trying to be so meticulous about it. But really, it includes like Betty Davis and LaBelle, a great song called "Who's Watching the Watcher," that I thought like was a perfect Opal Jewel song. There was a lot of songs that put me in the mindset. Either put me in the mindset of the characters, or that I felt like they would have been in the same vein as Opal and Nev. So there's that. But then among the newer artists, it was again like artists that I thought would have been influenced by Opal and Nev, or inspired by Opal especially. And so I love that playlist a lot, I have to say. I listen to it myself quite a bit.
It's great. It got me going today. And I will say, make sure that you find Dawnie's playlist, because there are some other people that have tried to use the Opal and Nev moniker, but find Dawnie's. It's the real deal.
It's actually very flattering that a lot, it's like fan lists. And there's this one where someone made a playlist simply of all the songs and bands that are referenced in the book. Specifically, which I thought, wow, how cool that somebody likes this book enough to do that.
Took the time.
It's flattering. Yeah.
No, that's fantastic. Also want to thank your session is sponsored in part today by Metters, Adam and Lee, an independent insurance agency in Little Rock, Arkansas, devoted to protecting assets of their clients. So we want to thank them for helping bring you to us today. If there are any other questions, that we did have one, someone wants to know if there's going to be a movie or anything. I know you probably can't say much.
I will say that would be a dream. That would be a dream. Fingers crossed. We'll see.
Fingers crossed. I think as you read the book, we can all of us see it. We start to even think about people we would want to play certain characters. But Dawnie, this has been fantastic. Thank you for writing such an amazing book. Thank you for spending time with us at the Six Bridges Book Festival today. And I can't wait to see what is coming next from you. I'm definitely a fan.
Thank you so much, Rhonda. And thanks to everyone at Six Bridges and to everyone who came today.
Thank you so much.